Let me first get the sound right. Can you hear me at the very top? Raise your hand if you hear me comfortably. Okay, perfect. So we can just lower this now, because I'm using this microphone. You still hear me fine?
Try it. Just try it.
Okay.
No. It's on mute now.
Okay. Well, thank you for having me. I've been doing a lot of speaking in the past few days and trying to catch up on sleep in the airplane and in cars. And today I was whisked from the airport to your city. And when I woke up, the driver said I was here. I opened my eyes and I felt like I was in an enchanted forest. It was just so beautiful. At any rate, the city, the street where my hotel is. So I envy those of you who go to school here or live here. It's a truly beautiful place, and thank you for having me. This evening I'm going to do something I usually don't do. For the past several years, or actually I'm afraid to say for the past several decades, when I've lectured on the Israel-Palestine conflict, I usually like to just set out the historical record, the factual record, as I understand it, and hopefully to, in the process, dispel some of the myths and outright falsifications that surround the Israel-Palestine conflict. But this year, usually at the beginning of an academic year, I try to figure out a new framework for a lecture to be used then for the duration of the academic year. And there were very few new political developments in the Israel-Palestine conflict. And so I couldn't find a new political theme to structure a lecture around. And I was at a loss what to do or how to proceed. As it happened in August of this year, a young student from the Netherlands visited me, and he was carrying with him a copy of an anthology entitled The Essential Gandhi. And I had for many years wanted to read Gandhi. I couldn't find a good anthology. And when I tried to teach him, because no good anthology was available, I always ended up teaching Gandhi's autobiography. And that didn't go over too big in my classes. For those of you who have not read it, it reads something like this: Chapter 14, milk. Chapter 15, nuts. Chapter 16, fruit. Chapter 17, more on nuts, then more on fruit. And just didn't seem to grab students. Gandhi was very concerned not only with his diet, but making it as simple as possible. As he liked to say, my diet consists of milk, fruit, and one unboiled and unsalted vegetable. That's it. But then I picked up the anthology and I read it through once. And the more I read, the more intriguing I found it. And at some point, it then moved me to start looking at his collected works, which run into some 90 hefty volumes, around 500 pages each. And I started to plow through the collected volumes one by one. I got up to 23 before I had to start writing, or the people who sponsored me would have throttled me. And I have to say that as I read, my respect for him kept increasing and increasing. There's an expression in American English, I don't know if they use it here, familiarity breeds contempt. The more you know somebody who claims greatness, the less respect you have for them. But that really does not happen with Gandhi. The more you read, the more you gradually get filled with awe. He really was a very impressive personality. not because he had a great mind, and he never pretended to have a great mind, but because, first of all, of his sheer moral consistency and moral force. We have the expression in English to talk the talk and walk the walk. Gandhi talked and he walked. He practiced by his beliefs in a remarkably consistent, almost you might say, awesome fashion. That in itself has to impress, especially when you're in academic life where there's a lot more talk than walk. But beyond that, he presented a model of a life which in my older years I've come to see as admirable. Namely, Gandhi did not respect the divisions between the public and the private, or the personal and the political. He didn't think there was a Chinese wall separating the two, that life was one seamless whole, and it was all about the search for truth. And there were really no hierarchies. It's not, in his view, correct to say that what appears to be a trivial item of your personal life is more important or looms larger than the great political struggles of the day. No, for him, they were all of equal significance, equal value, and of equal implication. So when you read his collected works, you'll find on one page he's talking about the struggle against British colonialism, and on the next page he's talking about his diet. On the next page he's telling you exactly how many pounds he gained or lost on a particular day, and in the fourth day he would express huge embarrassment that he had, to quote him, an erection in Bombay. And that was Gandhi. You can laugh, and of course the immediate reaction is to laugh, but then the respect begins to grow, because he liked to say his life was an open book. There's nothing about his life that's off limits, nothing about his life that's not worthy of being criticized or publicly discussed. And he treated his life as a kind of objective matter you put on a laboratory table and you just examine it. There's nothing to be ashamed of, nothing to be embarrassed of, just as long as when you discover a flaw in yourself, you make a real effort to correct it. If you don't make an effort to correct it, well, that's shameful. But to discover that you have flaws in yourself, there's nothing shameful about it, and nothing that you need hide about it or conceal. I, at any rate, maybe because it's my age, I found that a appealing way to look at life, and it certainly frees one of many psychological burdens. Well, then I started to read Gandhi with the lecture this evening in mind, and I decided I would try to take one aspect of Gandhi, not his diet, but his doctrine of nonviolence, nonviolent civil resistance, Satyagraha, and try to apply it to the Israel-Palestine conflict, and to see what we get. Are there useful lessons? Is there anything to be learned? My own view, as I'll try to convince you this evening, is in fact there is a great deal one can learn from Gandhi, and that he imparts important lessons about trying to achieve, finally, a just and lasting peace in the Israel-Palestine conflict. So my order of business this evening is basically the following. Number one, I want to set out the terms for resolving the Israel-Palestine conflict, the basic principles for a just and lasting peace. Number two, to clarify what are the obstructions, what are the obstacles to trying to achieve a just and lasting peace. Number three, to look at Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolence as a means for trying to, as it were, remove the obstructions, remove the obstacles. And then number 4, to see whether it works in the case of the Israel-Palestine conflict. Well, that having been said, let me begin from the beginning. Probably one of the best kept secrets, in fact, I dare say, the best kept diplomatic secret today is that there exists a consensus in the entire world community, with a couple of exceptions to which I'll return. There exists a consensus for resolving the Israel-Palestine conflict. It can be said, I think, that there is no conflict in the world today which is less complicated, no conflict in the world that is less controversial, no conflict in the world which is less complex, less intricate than the Israel-Palestine conflict. There is no conflict in the world where there exists so broad a consensus on the principle and the terms for its resolution. That sounds obviously like a very provocative assertion, and so now my task is to go beyond assertion to what would interest a rational audience, namely the evidence. So let's try quickly to go through the evidence. First of all, let's look at the most broadly representative political body in the world, namely the United Nations General Assembly. Every year at this time, literally at this time, November of every year, the United Nations General Assembly votes on a resolution titled Peaceful Settlement of the Question of Palestine. And the terms of the settlement are laid out every year in the resolution in virtually identical language. And the terms are the following: a 2-state settlement on the June 1967 border, which is to say Israel has to fully withdraw from the territories it occupied in June 1967, and a resolution of the Palestinian refugee question in accordance with the basic principle of the right of return and compensation. When I say a full withdrawal, the UN resolution is very clear. Israel has to vacate the whole of the West Bank, the whole of Gaza, and the whole of East Jerusalem, because it conquered them during the June 1967 war, and the basic principle of international law, grounded in Article 2 of the United Nations Charter, is that it's inadmissible to acquire territory by war. Israel acquired those territories by war. It has no legal title to them. Those are the terms of the resolution. I'll briefly go through the votes over the past 10 years, giving representative years. You can check yourself because it's on the web. Peaceful Settlement of the Palestine Question. You can find it at your own leisure. 1997, the vote, 155 to 2. The 2 negative votes, the United States and Israel. 2002, the vote, 160 to 4. The 4 negative votes, Israel, the United States, the Marshall Islands, and Micronesia. 2004, the vote, 161 to 7. The negative votes, Israel, the United States, Australia, Grenada, the Marshall Islands, Micronesia, and Palau. 2007, the last year, the vote, 161 to 7. Israel, the United States, Australia, the Marshall Islands, Micronesia, Nauru, and Palau. That means, well, for this year, the vote is occurring right as we speak, and it seems like Australia will this year join the rest of humanity. And so the vote will be Israel, the United States, the Marshall Islands, Micronesia, Nauru, Palau, and some years Tuvalu joins with Nauru and Palau. And so the vote will be Israel, the United States, the Marshall Islands, Micronesia, Nauru, Palau, and some years Tuvalu joins with Nauru and Palau. That's the vote every year. As the great human rights legal scholar John Dugard likes to put it, except for the United States, Israel, and those South Sea powerhouses, the entire world agrees on how to resolve the conflict. Some of you may want to say, well, the United Nations General Assembly is not just a political body, it's also a politicized body, and therefore we can't take these resolutions too seriously. I happen not to agree because the vote is so lopsided, so overwhelming, and so sustained over a significant period of time that the reasonable inference is this is not just political bargaining, but some basic principles are at stake, such that they account for the overwhelming support for such a resolution. However, for argument's sake, let's accept the UN General Assembly is a politicized body. Let's turn then from the most representative political body in the world to the most respected political body in the world, the International Court of Justice, the highest judicial body in the world. As it happens, in 2004, the General Assembly asked the International Court of Justice, which is an arm of the United Nations, asked the International Court of Justice to render an opinion on the legality of the wall that Israel has been building in the West Bank. In order for the International Court to render its opinion on the legality of the wall, it first had to render an opinion on the crucial issues bearing on the Israel-Palestine conflict. Some of you who are familiar with the lingo, the language of the so-called peace process, will know these issues as they're called the final status issues. That is to say, these are the issues which we're told are allegedly so complex, so intricate, that they have to be put off to the final stages of negotiations, because otherwise negotiations will immediately break down, they being so complicated, so complex. Those final status issues are typically said to be the following. Number 1, borders. Number 2, settlements. Number 3, East Jerusalem. And number 4, the refugees. Those are those allegedly complex questions. The International Court of Justice, in order to render its opinion on the legality of the wall, had to first address 3 of those 4 questions: borders, settlements, and East Jerusalem. The refugee question didn't bear on the particular issue of the legality of the wall. I'll return to that in a moment. What did the High Court decide? It decided that, number 1, Israel had no title to any of the West Bank, any of the Gaza, and any of East Jerusalem, because these are, to use the nomenclature of the International Court, these are occupied Palestinian territories. Why are they occupied Palestinian territories? Well, for the same reason as the General Assembly said, it's inadmissible to acquire territory by war. Israel acquired these territories in the course of the war. These territories have been set aside as the unit of self-determination for the Palestinian people. Israel has no title to them. They are very explicit throughout their advisory opinion. The West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and the Gaza are occupied Palestinian territories. Then they turned to the question of the settlements, and they said, well, under Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, all these settlements are illegal because it's inadmissible for an occupying power to transfer its population to occupied territory. On the 3 of the 4 questions that the court ruled on, as I said, the refugees we'll get to in a moment, it was a resounding defeat for Israel and a complete vindication of the Palestinian position. That's only half the story. The other half of the story is the vote itself. You would think if these were contentious issues, if they were controversial issues, If there were intricate or complex issues, you would think at the very least the vote would be close. Or complex issues, you would think at the very least the vote would be close. But the vote was not close at all. The vote was 14-1. The only dissenting vote came from the American judge Thomas Bergenthal, and even his dissent was highly qualified. He issued a statement which was not called a dissent, but he used a more neutral language, namely a declaration. And in his declaration, he stated that there is much in the majority opinion with which I agree. And then at the very end, he turned to the core issue in the conflict, namely the Israeli settlements. It's the core issue for the obvious reason that Israel doesn't want to occupy territories for their scenic value. It wants to exploit the resources that are available there. If the settlements become illegal, then the game is up. Israel has no interest in preserving its control of the occupied Palestinian territories. What does Judge Bergenthal decide? He says, bear in mind, this is the only negative vote. Bergenthal says there can be no question that under international law, the Fourth Geneva Convention, all the settlements are illegal, which is to say, and what are alleged to be the most controversial issues bearing on the Israel-Palestine conflict, the vote is at minimum 14-1, and on the core issue, the vote is effectively 15-0. That doesn't sound very controversial. Only one issue then remains the question of the refugees. As I said earlier, the United Nations General Assembly resolution, which always gets a lopsided vote in its favor, includes a passage stating the Palestinian refugees have a right to return and compensation. If we steer away again from that allegedly politicized body, the obvious place to look for enlightened opinion on the topic would be the respected human rights organizations in the world. So if I were to ask you what's the most respected human rights organization in the world today, you would answer Amnesty International. Well, Amnesty International in 2001 issued a policy statement on the question of the Palestinian refugees. And it stated, quote, "We call for Palestinians who fled or were expelled from Israel, the West Bank or Gaza Strip, along with those of their descendants who have maintained genuine links with the area, to be able to exercise their right to return." That's Amnesty. If we were to turn now to the other most respected human rights organization in the world, it would be Human Rights Watch. And as it happens, Human Rights Watch also issued a statement in 2000 on the question of the refugees. It stated, and I quote, "We urge Israel to recognize the right to return for those Palestinians and their descendants who fled from territory that is now within the state of Israel and who have maintained appropriate links with that territory." As you'll notice, the language is virtually identical to Amnesty International's language for the simple reason that these are not controversial questions in international law. These are the most basic principles, the tenets of international law. If we then move away from the global organizations and we move to the regional organization, it's the same picture. The Arab League, the most representative political body in the Arab world, in 2002, then 2007, then 2008, issued a peace plan for resolving the conflict. The peace plan called for a two-state settlement on the June 1967 border, a just resolution of the refugee question based on the right of return and compensation. The Arab League actually went one step beyond the international consensus. It also said if Israel agreed to these conditions, they would normalize relations with Israel, meaning trade, tourism, and so forth. The vote in the Arab League, the vote was unanimous, no dissents, 2002, 2007, 2008. The Palestinian Authority has agreed to these terms. The main opposition in the occupied territories, Hamas, has formally agreed to these terms. And that leaves us with the basic picture being rather uncomplicated and uncontroversial. There's a consensus among all parties in the world, bar two, if we leave aside for the moment the South Sea powerhouses. There's a consensus in the entire world, apart from two countries. And then the challenge becomes, this ought to be obvious, the challenge becomes how to get Israel and the United States to respect international law and public opinion. That's the obstruction, Israel and the United States, and then the challenge is, how do you remove this obstruction? How do you get the United States and Israel, or Israel backed by the United States, to respect international law and the enlightened opinion of humankind? And what I'll try now to do is to suggest that Gandhi, who faced a similar problem, namely how to end the British occupation of India, he worked out a strategy for trying to end it. And what I would like to do now is look at it. Parts of it you'll be familiar with, if not through having read Gandhi, then through having seen films about him, or just through, as it were, passed down wisdom. Part of the Gandhi I'm about to describe will be familiar to most people in this room, but another part of the Gandhi I think will be very surprising to many of you. At any rate, it came as something bordering on a shock when I read it the past couple of months. I have to begin with some caveats. Number one, it's very difficult to make generalizations about Gandhi. His collected works run to some 90 volumes. He lived a very long and very productive life. Gandhi was not one for light-hearted moments. He said, any moment spent in idleness or frivolity is a sin against God. And he apparently lived that life. Yes, he really did live that life. He was, for all his virtues, which are many, I do think he was just a wee bit too humorless. But he lived a very productive life, and it's hard to make generalizations. Although he himself, you can tell his basic creed, I wouldn't call it philosophy, his basic creed remained quite consistent over his life. His one major work, which is also rather modest in size, Hind Swaraj, he wrote it in 1909, but 30 years later he was still saying he still considers it an accurate exposition of his views, which seem to remain very consistent. He was like most of us, most mortals. He was filled with contradictions. He's the best known, or seems to be the best known pacifist in the world. But as some of you know, he supported the British during the Boer War. He supported the British during the Zulu War, and during World War I. He was recruiting Indians to fight in the British Army. Doesn't sound like much of a pacifist. He was taken to task for it. But Gandhi was somewhat averse, I think, to admitting to his inconsistencies. I won't call it hypocrisies because I have too high regard for him to use that kind of word. He's tries too hard to be consistent. I would call him a hypocrite. We'll just call him inconsistent. And you find statements in his collected works. He contradicts himself literally from day to day and week to week. One day he'll say that Hitlerism and Churchillism are in fact the same thing. He refuses to distinguish between the two during World War II. But then on another day he'll say there's a fundamental difference between fascism and British imperialism. Doesn't sound like you can easily reconcile those statements. I think if you confronted Gandhi, he wouldn't particularly care that much because he liked to say in his own words, I'm essentially a man of action and a reformer. I'm a practical reformer. Basically for him, anything that works and is moral, that's a crucial qualification, anything that works and is moral, he'll go with it because he wants to change the world. Whether it's consistent is not as important. Basically for him, anything that works and is moral, that's a crucial qualification, anything that works and is moral, he'll go with it because he wants to change the world. Whether it's consistent is not as important. It's also difficult to subject Gandhi's analysis to rational analysis because it was so deeply steeped in faith. As he said, it is faith that sustains me, and it is faith that must sustain the other Satyagrahis, the other practitioners of nonviolent resistance. When he decides whether or not to go on a fast, he doesn't make his decision based on, so to speak, the balance of forces or some overtly political criterion. He says, I have to wait for the inner urge, the inner voice, or the gift from God. He claims that Satyagraha, his creed of nonviolence, is a science, but it's a strange sort of science because he says its power drew, and now I'm quoting him, from the efficacy of the incalculable force of inscrutable divinity, which means it's not easily susceptible to external proof or refutation. For all his virtues, he was also a bit of an egomaniac or megalomaniac. He describes himself as the author of Satyagraha, the general in Satyagraha action, the sole authority on Satyagraha, and the most experienced Satyagraha, which is basically Gandhi's way of saying, and he didn't mince words, if you don't agree with what I say, go somewhere else. He didn't tolerate criticism, and he was very forthright about it. Gandhi, it will come as a surprise, and I'll discuss it a little later. Gandhi was very given to military and martial imagery. He liked to think of himself as a general. His followers were an army, and he says, just as in an army, the conscripts don't question the officers, nobody should be questioning me. He liked to use the phrase, mine is not to reason why, mine is just to do and die. But he doesn't use that phrase for himself, it's for his followers to just do and die. Which is to say that, once again, it's hard to subject Gandhi's creed to rational analysis, but I do think it can be done, and that's what I'm going to try to do now. First of all, what is Satyagraha, the nonviolent civil resistance? Most of you will know it as nonviolence in thought, in word, and in deed. Gandhi was very careful that it's not enough to be nonviolent in deed, in action. Your thoughts and your words have to be also free of nonviolence. Just as in his philosophy of brahmacharya, to be sexually celibate, it's not enough not to do the evil deed. You have to also not speak about it or think about it. Had he been alive today, he would also not be allowed to surf for it on the web, which would probably disqualify 499 of 500 people here who would be very poor brahmacharis. I heard some nervous laughter from the one who thought it didn't apply to him. Gandhi's creed was not essentially negative, but it was active. And the active impulse for him, it sounds kind of corny, it sounds kind of saccharine, but for him the active impulse or principle of human relations is, as he puts it, unadulterated love, faith in the inherent goodness of human nature. He's a kind of grown-up Anne Frank. And at the beginning it evokes kinds of cynicism. For those of you who are of my generation, it begins to sound like when the moon is in the 7th house and Jupiter aligns with Mars, then peace will guide the planets and love will stare the stars. Well, yeah, that's the, that's how, those were good times, don't let them fool you. But as you read it more, you certainly become convinced that for Gandhi, this is not Oprah. He's very serious. He genuinely believes it. And then he, in very simple terms, marshals arguments which kind of make you think. So some people say, Gandhi, how can you believe that unadulterated love is the governing principle of humankind and human history? What about all the wars, all the killing, all the murder, all the mayhem? How do you account for that? And Gandhi responds, if it were true that violence or hate ruled us, we should have become extinct long ago. Well, on reflection, I think that's a pretty impressive response. Some people say, but Gandhi, haven't you studied history? Isn't history about war after war after war after war? And Gandhi responds, history is really a record of every interruption of the even working of the force of love or of the soul. History is really a record of every interruption of the even working of the force of love or of the soul. Meaning, he says, what we take to be history, those wars, those killings, those rampages, he says, those are the aberrations in history. That's why they enter the history books. Most of the time in the university classroom or lecture hall, people carry on like we're carrying on today. Mutual respect, civility, and a basic regard for each other. That would never enter the history book. What would enter the history book if somebody were now to come in and spray this room with an Uzi, and several people were to die. And that's Gandhi's point. What enters history are the aberrations. But most of the time, throughout history, people, animated by the principle of mutual love, mutual affection, people do get along. History is just a record of the interruptions in a normally civilized existence. And he thinks that why can't we expand this principle of love, the principle that holds families together, prevents family disputes and spats from descending into violence most of the time. Now, once in a while a husband throtbles a wife, or a wife hires somebody to kill her husband, but that's an interruption in the even working of the force of love. And he wonders or asks, why can't that same principle be applied to all of humankind? And he's very, let's call it, generous in his application of this principle. During World War II, he famously wrote a letter to, quote, dear friend, the dear friend being Adolf Hitler, and he said to Hitler that, quote, I do not believe that you are the monster described by your opponents. But then, of course, he went on to say, although many of your acts are monstrous and unbecoming of human dignity. Gandhi's approach to nonviolence was you not only had to be nonviolent, but for him, crucially, you had to also be non-coercive. The way you try to reach people, you try to reach them through self-suffering. If you engage in enough self-suffering, then you can awaken the conscience, awaken the love impulse, even in your most determined and apparently vicious foe. Or so he believed. For him, you have to convert, not coerce. And coerce includes non-violent forms of coercion. They are also, for him, a taboo. He opposed violence for the obvious reasons that most of you know. Those who become violent are degraded to the level of a beast, in his view. But more importantly, or at least as importantly, he opposed violence because he said that those who get engaged in violence end up corrupting their goal. There is a nexus, that's the fancy word for a connection between means and ends. As he liked to put it, the means may be likened to a seed, the end to a tree. If you use violent means, you're going to end up corrupting the end. Violence may destroy one or more bad rulers, he said, but others will pop up in their places. Speaking as a one-time Maoist, Marxist, Leninist, Bolshevik, and all the rest, looking back, I think he makes a strong case. that those who use violence in order to attain power, as legitimate as it might be, and I'll get to that in a moment, you can't but deny that it becomes a corruptive or corrosive force on those who have employed it, however noble their goals might have been. What is less known about Gandhi is, we can say, I think, without any reason, without any fear of contradiction, though a certain amount of surprise, Gandhi was not a categorical opponent of violence. There were many qualifications he entered, of which two I want to look at quickly now. Number one, it was Gandhi's view that he wants to recommend nonviolence, but he recognizes, according to the contemporary standards of right and wrong, people are allowed to resort to violence. And you have no right to tell people they can't use violence, or tell some people they can't use violence, because that's the current standard of right and wrong. You can. So he says, for example, if you face a personal insult, if you feel humiliated, you will be justified in slapping the bully in the face, or taking whatever action you might deem necessary to vindicate your self-respect. For those of you who remember or know the famous line that's often quoted with Malcolm X, by any means necessary, it comes as a certain surprise to learn his actual precursor is Mahatma Gandhi. By any means necessary, you have the right to take whatever action you might deem necessary to vindicate your self-respect. On the specific question of the Palestinians in the 1930s, Gandhi was already a significant political actor, and as some of you will know, a revolt broke out in Palestine against the British Mandate and the Zionist colonization of Palestine. And Gandhi was asked his opinion. It was a very violent revolt against the British mandate and the Zionist colonization. Gandhi responded, well, I can't defend the Arab excesses, and I wish they had chosen nonviolence to resist what they rightly regarded as the unjustified encroachment upon their country. But then he went on to say, in unequivocal terms, according to the accepted canons of right and wrong, nothing can be said against the Arab resistance in the face of overwhelming odds. That's the current standard, and nobody has the right to impose on any single people a higher moral standard than the one that currently exists. You can recommend, you can prefer, but you can't deny to some people the right that others have under current existent morality. The second qualification he enters will come as, I think, a much bigger surprise. Namely, Gandhi had a kind of hierarchy. He prefers that you use nonviolence for reasons which we already looked at. But he says, if you don't have the inner strength, the moral reserves, to take all the blows, as he puts it smilingly and cheerfully, if you don't have it in you, and then the only choice is between hitting back and running away, Gandhi is very clear. You better hit back and hit back hard, because there is nothing for Gandhi more contemptible, more reprehensible, more shameful than cowardice and weakness. It's not violence that Gandhi detests the most, it's cowardice and weakness. If you read his writings, the words that constantly appear are manhood, manliness. Be a man, says Gandhi. If you read his writings, the words that constantly appear are manhood, manliness. Be a man, says Gandhi. Be a man at most by taking the blows. But if you can't, you better hit back and hit back hard. The fundamental thing to be borne in mind, says Gandhi, is that people should, under no circumstances, be cowardly or impotent. It is unmanly to run away from danger. And nothing filled him with more disgust than people who used nonviolence to mask their cowardice. For those of you, or weakness, for those of you who've read Nietzsche, his genealogy of morals, he's exactly on the same page with Nietzsche on this question. Nietzsche detests those Christian ethics which weak people adopt because they don't have the courage to hit back. And Gandhi says, word for word, the exact same thing. I ask you, says Gandhi, is our nonviolence the nonviolence of the coward, the weak, the helpless, the timid? In that case, it is of no value. A weakling is a born saint. A weak person is obliged to become a saint. But we are soldiers of nonviolence, who, if the occasion demands, will lay down their lives for it. If one makes use of nonviolence in order to disguise one's weakness, it makes a coward of you. Using physical force with courage is far superior to cowardice. At least we would have attempted to act like men. I cannot stand cowardice. Let no one say when I am gone that I taught the people to be cowards. If you think my nonviolence amounts to that or leads you to that, you should reject it without hesitation. I would far rather that you died bravely dealing a blow and receiving a blow than died in abject terror. Cowardice is worse than violence because cowards can never be nonviolent. So such people should learn to defend themselves. Gandhi saw no inconsistency between his creed of nonviolence and his revulsion of weakness, because in his view, being nonviolent requires a lot more courage and bravery than to be violent. Intuitively, that just doesn't sound right. But then when you begin to read Gandhi, it makes perfect sense. Because he says to be truly nonviolent is to be willing to march into the valley of death unarmed, as he puts it, smilingly and cheerfully. To be willing to face the bullets, face your death, but not armed to resist, not armed to retaliate, but simply to acquiesce in your death. I believe that a man is the strongest soldier for daring to die unarmed, with his breast bare before the enemy. Where is courage required, he asked, in blowing others to pieces from behind a cannon, or with a smiling face to approach a cannon and to be blown to pieces? By that standard, it seems to me a reasonable argument to say there's no inconsistency between Gandhi's revulsion of weakness and cowardice and his preference for nonviolence, but always bearing in mind the true Gandhi and not the Hollywood or made-for-television Gandhi. The true Gandhi, if you don't have it in you to march smilingly and cheerfully to your death, unarmed, and the only choices are to run away or to hit back hard, Gandhi says, you better hit back hard or you're a weakling and a coward. How does this Satyagraha work? Well, here Gandhi is a little bit, I think, not a little bit, he's very inconsistent. Because Gandhi is very insistent, as I said a few moments ago, that his philosophy is one born of love. You suffer enough, you'll make your oppressor see your humanity, and as Gandhi liked to say, because he was mostly talking about men, make his heart melt. So Gandhi would say, had the Jews suffered enough during World War II, they could have, to use his image that he uses over and over again, they could have made Hitler's heart melt. Hitler heart melt sounds like an unusual sequence of words, but Gandhi apparently believed it. But if you look at his actual creed in action, he's really not very consistent, because a large part of his actual creed in action is what he calls non-cooperation. Non-cooperation is what we would nowadays call a strike or a general strike. Workers walk out of their plant, they refuse to cooperate, or a whole society refuses to cooperate with a government. But when you walk off your job, you go on strike, or a whole population goes on a general strike, they're obviously not trying to evoke love from their opponents. It's being coercive. You're trying to get your employer or your government to recognize that the costs are too high and it's preferable to settle. That's not love. That's coercion. It's not violent coercion, but it is coercion. Even if you take at the other extreme the most self-suffering form of action, say a fast until the death. Gandhi had many quarrels with his critics who insisted to him, Gandhi, who are you kidding? You know full well that when you go on a fast, you're not moving your opponent from from love. It's coercion. You're coercing them to give in to your demands because you're threatening. If you don't give in, I'm going to die. And if I die, this whole society is going to break into civil revolt. That's coercion. And so even fasting, which seems like the ultimate form of self-suffering, Gandhi would deny it and make all sorts of explanations, but it clearly has a coercive element. Just as those of you who are parents, when the holiday season comes around and your child says to purchase this gift for him or her, or he or she will hold his or her breath till they're blue and they die, that's coercive unless you're indifferent to your child's fate. I want to say just a few words which are crucial about Gandhi's doctrine of self-suffering. I have to make one main point, and then I want to move on to the Israel-Palestine conflict. That is, self-suffering can't possibly work as a tactic unless there is agreement on the goal which you are pursuing. That is to say, you can't just be innocent in your means, nonviolence, but you have to also be innocent in your ends. That is to say, the goal of your nonviolence has to be recognized as legitimate by society. In practice, what does that mean? Take the case of the United States. In the U.S., our country is about divided, they say, 50-50 on the question of abortion. About 50% of our society is pro-choice. About 50% of our society is pro-life. If you were to have, engage in a little thought experiment and imagine if the 50% of the people in our society who are pro-life were to descend on all the abortion clinics in the United States, surround the clinics and say, we are going to go on a fast until the death unless abortion is illegalized. The pro-life people, the pro-choice people, at best, will be moved to pity the pro-life people. They may be moved to pity, and that's also a big maybe. But it's inconceivable that even if the pro-life people fasted until the death, the pro-choice people would relinquish the right to abortion. Self-suffering can only work if society at large has already agreed, latently or blatantly, that the goal you're pursuing is legitimate. And if the goal you're pursuing is seen as legitimate, then your aim is to try to get the public to act on what its conscience already tells it is wrong. A lot of people know things are wrong, but they don't act on them. And then the purpose of the self-suffering, the fast, and other forms of civil disobedience is to use Gandhi's image to quicken the conscience, to awaken the conscience to the fact that what's happening is wrong. It can't be avoided anymore. It can't be evaded anymore because these people are out there suffering and they're making the wrong known. And then hopefully people will act. That's his expectation. And as I say, the expectation hinges on the public recognition that there's something wrong. And Gandhi was very clear on that. Whenever he undertook a campaign, for example, to rid Hinduism of what he called the blot of untouchability, or to rid India of the scourge of alcoholism. When people would ask Gandhi, why alcoholism and not other vices, his answer was very straightforward. He would say, the drink evil, alcoholism, has been recognized as such by the people of this land, but the other evils are more or less fashionable. Gandhi is a practical reformer. He changes, He changes what can practically be changed. And what in his mind can practically be changed are those violations of human rights, morality, where society already recognizes latently, not necessarily at the forefront of their consciousness, that there is a wrong here. Having said that, let me now turn to the Israel-Palestine conflict and see what we can learn or apply from Gandhi. First of all, a couple of qualifications again. No one has the right to tell Palestinians that they must renounce violent means to end the occupation. Why? It's the Gandhian standard. According to the accepted canons of right and wrong, people are allowed to use violence to oust occupiers. Of course, according to current standards, that means you cannot target civilians. That's part of current right and wrong being what's embodied in what's called humanitarian law or human rights law, a fundamental principle of which is you cannot target civilians. But apart from that crucial qualification, every other people is allowed to use violence to evict occupiers. No one has the right to tell Palestinians they cannot. Number two, using the Gandhian standard, not my own, if Palestinians cannot find the moral reserves to practice nonviolence, then according to the Mahatma, it is not only their right, but their duty to hit back and hit back hard those who have wrecked their lives and violated their persons. Palestinians are not obliged to acquiesce in assaults on their human dignity. Quite the contrary, they have a responsibility to defend their dignity against such assaults. Quite the contrary, they have a responsibility to defend their dignity against such assaults. In Gandhi's words, non-violently if they can, but violently if they must. If I suggest now this evening that Palestinians should use nonviolent civil resistance, it's not because I think they should be held or they should hold themselves to a higher standard. It's because of one of Gandhi's practical insights. He's very insistent that whatever you can accomplish with violence, you can also accomplish with nonviolence, but with a far lesser loss of human life. As a general proposition, that obviously cannot be proved. So during World War II, Gandhi was adamant that had the countries which had been occupied by the Axis, had they engaged in non-cooperation and non-violent civil resistance, that the Nazis could have been defeated. It's possible, it's purely speculative, but obviously it's also possible that nonviolence would not have worked, and honest people will say, whatever the loss is, it is true that violent resistance did defeat the Axis powers. However, in the specific case of Israel and Palestine, I think it can work. Why? Take the last 7 years, what's called the Second Intifada. Palestinians, approximately 5,000 Palestinians were killed during the Second Intifada, 1,000 of them children. On the Israeli side, 1,000 killed, about 160 children. Honest people doing their reckoning, I think, would say, for all the death, for all the bloodletting, Palestinians at the end of 8 years have very little to show for it, apart from the dubious value of Israel's redeployment in Gaza. It's arguable that had they used nonviolent civil resistance, the balance sheet would have been much better. Some people say, but wait, didn't Palestinians use nonviolent civil resistance during the First Intifada, 1987 to 1993? And isn't it true that they had nothing to show for it at the end? I think half is true, half is not. The First Intifada was overwhelmingly nonviolent on the Palestinian side, overwhelmingly brutal and bloodthirsty on the Israeli side. There's no question about that. As a personal matter, I lived in the occupied territories during the First Intifada. The first couple of years, the most violence you saw were 8-year-old kids throwing stones from makeshift barricades at Israeli soldiers who were so far down the street that the stones never even reached them. It was purely symbolic, and that was the maximum violence during the first couple of years, 88 and 89. That part is true. I don't think it's true that they had nothing to show for it. The Israeli army was thrown into disarray by the First Intifada. Israel suffered a major public relations disaster, and it's quite possible that had it gone on longer and had it not been subverted by the Palestinian leadership, it's possible, you can't say for certain, it would have succeeded or had more success than it did in the end. Why do I think it might work today? Well, that brings us back to my introductory remarks. Namely, as I said, the crucial condition for the success of the Gandhian program is there has to be a consensus in public opinion that what the Palestinians want is legitimate, it's reasonable, it's moral, it's legal. And as I pointed out in the earlier remarks, there is now a consensus in the international community. The Palestinian demands an end to the occupation, a reasonable resolution of the refugee question. Those demands have now been sanctioned as reasonable by the whole of the international community. The challenge now is people know what the Palestinians demand is reasonable, or enlightened public opinion, the International Court of Justice, human rights organizations say the Palestinian demands are legal and moral. The challenge now is inform the public The Palestinians are not asking for the sun, the moon, and the skies. They're simply asking for what the International Court of Justice says they're entitled to. They're simply asking what Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch says they are entitled to. They're simply asking what the General Assembly says each year they're entitled to. And so the challenge now is twofold. On the Palestinian side, for them to engage in a form of nonviolent civil resistance which rivets international attention on the injustices that unfold on a daily basis in the occupied territories. And the challenge for us, the challenge for all of us, is to inform public opinion. These demands are not unreasonable. They carry the legitimacy of the most respected and representative political and judicial bodies and human rights bodies in the world today. Here, I think we can learn important lessons from the Zionist movement. down because the highest judicial body in the world said it's illegal. Why are they knocking it down? Because we're doing what the ICJ said. They said the wall had to be dismantled. The international community has been delinquent in its legal responsibility to demolish that wall. They won't do it, then we have to do it. It's a citizen's arrest, so to speak. Well, I'm not naive. Yes, Israel will probably kill 100 of the demonstrators, 200 of the demonstrators, 300 of the demonstrators. Killing the Palestinians is their default setting. But long before they reach 5,000, it seems to me if we do our job here and publicize the fact that the Palestinians are only doing what their legal responsibility or right entitles them to do, then I think long before we reach 5,000, Israel will have to stop. Now, I enter again one crucial caveat. I'm speaking or writing from the comfort of my home and the safety of my home in New York, and now the comfort and safety of beautiful Maastricht University in the city. And I would be the last one on God's earth to tell other people to die for any cause. I am not a hero. I cannot go marching into the valley of death smilingly and cheerfully. I am quite sure I would be going in the other direction, even if a gun were put to my head. However, the Palestinians have already shown a willingness to die, a willingness to give their lives for their human dignity, their self-respect, and an end to what seems to be an interminable torment. If they've already made the decision, which I frankly, in fact, emphatically admit, I don't have it in me to do, if they make that decision, I say, why not say what Gandhi says? Nonviolence can accomplish what violence can accomplish, but with much less human suffering. Much less if we do our job here. If we don't do our job here, then in the darkness and the shadows, they'll be slaughtered. I have no doubt about that. There are many other things I wanted to say, but time is pressing, and we have to hear from one other person, and then to hear from you. I'll just make a couple of other points. Number one, for this strategy to work, the public has to see the goals of the Palestinians as being legitimate. And I told you, or I tried to relate to you, what is the current international consensus of what's a legitimate, legal, moral settlement of the conflict. And I told you, or I tried to relate to you, what is the current international consensus of what's a legitimate, legal, moral settlement of the conflict. That means there is no consensus for dismantling the Zionist entity. There is no consensus for a one-state settlement, leaving aside the moral issues involved and sticking strictly to the practical issues. If you start demanding not an end to the occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, and a just resolution of the refugee question, and you start making these demands for one state in Palestine, or dismantling the Zionist entity, as it's sometimes called, well, leaving aside the moral issues and sticking strictly to the practical ones, the Gandhi strategy has no possibility of success, because there is no consensus in enlightened public opinion. There is no consensus in representative public opinion for a one-state settlement or for the dismantling of the state of Israel. And without that consensus, as I put earlier, the legitimacy or the innocence of means, but there has to also be an innocence of ends. The goals of the Palestinians have to be seen as legitimate, and this one-state talk or dismantling the Zionist entity, it has exactly zero legitimacy in the international community. Let me then end by going back to Mr. Gandhi. Gandhi liked to translate the word Satyagraha, S-A-T-Y-A-G-R-A-H-A. It makes for a nice t-shirt. He translated as hold on to the truth. And I like that image. Hold on to the truth. And that's our challenge, to hold on to the truth that what Israel has done to the Palestinians is wrong. To hold on to the truth that Israel's refusal, backed by the United States, to respect international law and the considered opinion of humankind is the sole obstacle to putting an end to their suffering. We can win. We can win if we hold on to the truth. And if, to quote the African Americans, to putting an end to their suffering. We can win. We can win if we hold on to the truth. And if, to quote the African American spiritual, we keep our eyes on the prize and hold on. How many of you know that song? To keep your eyes on the prize and hold on. Well, it's a beautiful black spiritual. If I were in my classroom now, I'd immediately go here, YouTube, hold on, and the rest, but I don't teach anymore. What does that mean? It means, number one, to keep remembering what the struggle, the prize, is all about. It's not about theoretical fads, post this and post that. It's not about intellectual provocations. It's not about holier-than-thou radical posturing. It's about something much more humdrum, much more prosaic by comparison. The prize, it's about freeing the Palestinian people from their bondage. And then to hold on. To hold on means to be ready for sacrifice and for the long haul. But also to remember, whatever sacrifices we make here in Europe, North America, they're trivial and they're petty. They're meaningless next to the sufferings or the burdens or the sacrifices that the Palestinian people must daily make, and the burdens, sacrifices that people in 90% of the world have to make to achieve elementary justice. I lost my job. I wasn't happy about it. I have my moments of self-pity. So far as my friends are concerned, too many moments of self-pity. But in my sober moments, I don't forget that sacrifice is so trivial. I lost a job. In about 3/4 of this world, if you try to tell the truth, you don't lose a job. You lose a limb, a body part, or your life. You get your tongue cut out, you get your ears cut off, you get your arms cut off, your legs cut off, your head cut off. That's the real world. In particular, in those glorious democracies that the United States promotes in the Middle East, like Egypt and Jordan, that's what happens when you tell the truth. Our sacrifices are so trivial, small change. But if we're willing to make those sacrifices, and we're willing to go for the long haul, keep your eyes on the prize and hold on. And then as we do, We have to bear in mind, I think, the wisdom of the Caribbean poet M.A. Césaire. He said, "There's room for everyone at the rendezvous of victory." It's a beautiful line. I hope you all memorize it. It doesn't come from me. There's room for everyone at the rendezvous of victory. I came across it because the late Edward Said used to like to quote it in the last years of his life. It means that we want to nurture a movement and not create another cult. The victory to which we aspire is inclusive, not exclusive. It's not at anyone's expense. It is to be victorious without vanquishing. No one is a loser, not a Palestinian and not an Israeli. No one is a loser, and we are all gainers if together we stand by truth and justice. I am not anti-English. I am not anti-British. I am not anti-any government, Gandhi said, but I am anti-untruth. I am anti-humbug, nonsense, which is most of the time what we hear about the Israel-Palestine conflict. I am anti-humbug, and I'm anti-injustice. And that, I think, should be our attitude as well. We are not anti-Jewish, we are not anti-Israel, and for that matter, we are not anti-Zionist. The prize on which our eyes should be fixed is human rights, human dignity, human equality. Nobody should be put to ideological litmus tests. Are you now, or have you ever been, a Zionist? I couldn't care less what your philosophy is, what your ideology is, what your political creed is. I want an answer to basic questions of principle, basic questions of conscience, basic questions of human rights. Are you for or against ethnic cleansing? Are you for or against torture? Are you for or against house demolitions? Are you for or against Jews-only roads and Jews-only settlements? Are you for or against discriminatory laws? And if the answer comes against, and against, then I say, keep your ideology, whatever it might be. There's room for everyone at the rendezvous of victory. May we all, seekers of truth, fighters for justice, yet live to join the people of Palestine, the tormented people of Palestine, at the rendezvous of victory. Thank you.